If you wanted to watch a movie at home in the 1980s, you couldn't just press a button. And if you were too late, the night didn't happen the way you planned. You debated movie titles amongst your family. You, your siblings, cousins piled into the hatchback, drove to the nearest Blockbuster, walked through those thick blue doors under fluorescent lights, and hoped the movie you wanted was still there. Video rental stores were once found in nearly every town and neighborhood in America. On Friday nights, their parking lots were full to the brim. And then suddenly, in less than a single generation, they were gone. Movies became easy to access without leaving your house. But for nearly 2 decades, renting a movie wasn't just common. It felt like a family tradition. For many families, it wasn't just entertainment. It was the thing you did on Friday night or weekend, after dinner, after homework, after a long week, friends planning a sleepover with games and pizza. You didn't just watch a movie. You had to physically go and get one. There was anticipation in the car, negotiations, cousins arguing in front of the horror section, parents voting something at the last second, someone dramatically putting a case back on the shelf. You'd clutch a backup title, just in case, scanning the return bin like it was a treasure chest. And when you grabbed the last copy from behind the display cover, it felt like you'd hit jackpot. That wasn't just excitement, it was bonding. It was a shared moment you couldn't replicate alone on a couch with a remote. And once you brought that tape home, that was it. You were locked and committed. There was no switching to something else after 10 minutes. You'd hear the VCR whir as it swallowed the tape. Sometimes you had to rewind it first because the last person didn't. And if it wasn't rewound, you sighed and waited. In the 1980s and 1990s, watching a movie at home needed planning. You didn't just put something on. Most stores followed a similar layout. New releases right at the front, the wall everyone rushed toward, action and thrillers along one side, comedy and drama along another, family movies somewhere safer, where parents lingered. The cases on display were empty. If the box was there, you felt a flicker of relief. If it wasn't, someone else had beaten you to it. By 7:30 p.m., the front wall could already be stripped bare. Rows of empty slots where the excited and happy titles had been. That was part of the experience. There was a quiet panic to get there early, because if you were too late, the night didn't just change. It felt different. Holidays were worse. The night before Christmas, the night before Thanksgiving, the shelves were chaos. You could feel the tension in the aisle. Behind the counter were rows of actual VHS tapes in thick plastic cases. When you finally made your decision, you'd slide the empty display box across the counter. The clerk would disappear for a moment, come back with the real tape, scan your membership card, and hand you a receipt with the return date stamped across the top. New releases were usually due back in 2 nights. Older titles bought you a little more time. And if you forgot, there was a fee. Late fees weren't small either. They were a real part of how these stores stayed in business. For some chains, they made up a significant slice of the revenue. Some families had that talk in the car on the way back about remembering next time. You didn't want to be the reason the bill was higher than it should have been, but people paid them because owning the movie wasn't realistic. In the early days of VHS, buying a single tape could cost $80 or more. That wasn't casual money. Renting made sense. The math was simple. Movies were expensive to own. The store gave you access for a few dollars. So what changed? This is the story of how we went from planning movie night to simply pressing play. The entire system depended on 2 conditions. First, that movies lived on something physical, a tape, a disc, something you could hold. Second, that the only way to access them was to go somewhere and get them. For a while, both were true, and as long as they were true, the store made sense. Then things started to change. The first shift was technological. DVD-S replaced VHS tapes. They were thinner, cleaner. You didn't have to rewind them. They were cheaper to manufacture and easier to stack, ship, and store. Owning movies started to feel possible. Do you remember building a shrine wall of purchased DVD-S, categorized your favorites at the top with kids' choices at the bottom so they could see and reach them? This was not just something collectors did. It was a staple amongst homes. The second shift was distribution. In the late 1990s, Netflix introduced a mail-order DVD service. You picked movies online. Red envelopes showed up in your mailbox. It felt strange at first. No fluorescent lights, no aisles, no last copy to grab. Just a quiet envelope in the mail. Movie night had gone silent. And most importantly, there were no late fees. And that's the part that mattered and what shifted gears further. For years, late fees had been part of the deal. You set reminders. You rushed back before closing. You dropped tapes through the slot at 11:58 p.m. Suddenly, that pressure just was completely gone. You kept the movie as long as you wanted. You sent it back when you were done. It didn't feel dramatic at first, but expectations quietly shifted. The final shift was digital. As broadband internet expanded in the 2000s, streaming technology quietly improved. At first, it buffered. It froze. Remember that internet connection sound while it dialed in? The picture looked compressed and strange. For some, it wasn't streaming at all. It was recording movies off late-night television onto blank VHS tapes. For others, it was downloads, LimeWire, torrents, waiting hours for a file to finish, hoping it wasn't a fake. But over time, it just worked. You realized something. You didn't have to get in the car. You didn't have to wonder if the new release was gone. You didn't have to glance at the return date stuck to the back. You just pressed play. What had once felt like a small event became something instant. The economic logic that once supported rental stores began to crack. Physical stores needed rent, lights on, staff behind the counter, shelves stocked and restocked. Streaming didn't, and neither did a file shared quietly online. When delivering a movie digitally became cheaper, or effectively free, then keeping a storefront open, the balance tipped. And once it tipped, it didn't tip back. Large chains struggled to adapt. Blockbuster tried mail-order DVDs, then streaming. But by then, it was carrying the weight of thousands of storefronts. Leases signed years earlier, lights that still had to stay on, and even when they stayed on, people weren't there. In 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. Independent shops had already begun disappearing long before that. The decline wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. One store closing, then another. By the early 2010s, most video rental stores were gone. Many of the buildings are still there. You might have even driven past one recently, reminiscing at the Blockbuster logo, now seeing it be a gray, empty, abandoned warehouse. They're just something else now, a gym, a church, a dollar store, and you can almost tell someone's age when they say, that's where the Blockbuster used to be. But the disappearance wasn't only economic, it was structural. In 2004, there were more than 9,000 Blockbuster stores worldwide. By 2014, almost all of them were gone. That kind of collapse doesn't just close businesses. It rewrites habits. Video rental once required coordination, a time, a place, a shared decision. Streaming removed geography from the equation. It removed store hours. It removed the last copy on the shelf tension. And when friction disappears, behavior changes. There was also a social layer that quietly vanished. Clerks who knew your taste. Regulars you recognized. The low hum of rewinding machines behind the counter. Now, movie selection happens alone. On separate screens, in separate rooms, a couple sitting on the same couch, scrolling in complete silence with all the time in the world, just spoilt for choice and no panic of time. Not arguing about what to watch, just going with the flow, because you can always just switch whatever doesn't hold your attention. Some would argue what we have now is better. More choice, no late fees, no rewinding. Let me know in the comments. Do you revisit these times and smile at the memories of venturing out to the store? Or do you smile at all the times you've hit play on Netflix? A small weekly ritual that structured the weekend. When the stores disappeared, the ritual disappeared with them. If you remember your local store, the name on the sign, the carpet zigzag patterns, I'd be interested to hear it. Because sometimes what we miss isn't the building. It's the feeling of having to go somewhere to begin the night.